It's a huge honour to welcome Thomasina Miers, OBE, to our 2020 Online Trend Summit. We welcome Thomasina with her considerable experience as a mum, as a cook, as a restaurateur, and a writer to talk about her passion for Mexican food, how she balances the running of a restaurant brand with some of the bigger topics on the future horizon within food and drink, from biodiversity and soil health to hospitality 2.0 and food poverty. Thomasina, welcome. It's amazing to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
No problem at all. Can we start with, just an observation for all the things that I've read and seen you talk about on TV and cookery programs. You have a massive energy and passion for all matters food and drink. Where did this all begin?
I think I literally was born greedy. Maybe that came from there. But no, funny enough, I loved being in the kitchen. I loved being with my mother. Mm-hmm. And I was really bad at playing with dolls. And my brother and sister could amuse themselves for hours in the playroom. And mm-hmm. I would just go and find my mother kind of concocting these amazing things in the kitchen. And we had very little money when I was growing up. But my mother could make magic things happen with 20 minutes, some butter and some onions. You know, she'd make this kind of amazing alchemy. And so from really early on, she would just teach me how to get flavor from very few ingredients. And I was just hooked. And I think as I grew up, it was, I just found it very boring being kind of at home every day. What should I do myself? And so kind of creating stuff from what was in the fridge was my favorite way to spend time after school. And my mother very early on just let me get away with it. Just say, go on, help yourself. And now I was cooking supper for everyone.
And were there any particular sort of principles or things that you remember really fondly, or recipes from that time?
Well, I think seasoning food was always really important. That was my mother's first point of call, was to taste food and to season it properly. And those are two lessons that it's amazing how few people, if they're not brought up with food, forget how important it is to taste your own food and to season it deliciously. And of course you can season with all sorts of things, not just salt and pepper, but acidity from a lemon and lime or vinegar. Parmesan cheese can add lovely umami. There's all sorts of ways, bit of nori or and those lessons were really important. And I remember the pride of which one summer she had a couple of aubergines, which in those days she used to say were very expensive vegetable, but in the summer it became cheaper. And I remember finding this recipe in an old cookbook of hers where I stuffed it with a tomato sauce. I made a slow cooked tomato and aubergine sauce from the middle, and then topped it with breadcrumbs and garlic and a bit of Parmesan cheese. And it tasted so incredible. And yet there were these very simple ingredients. So it was just that real magic that I kind of discovered quite early on you could do in the kitchen. And the gratitude with which everyone treated you when you presented food that made them feel happy and good.
That's just it's a wonderful gift, isn't it? If you understand the basic principles of how to cook, being able to bring people together, and that kind of family unity that comes with putting food in front of people, and the joy that comes with it. It is a special thing, really special thing.
But it's not just special, of course. What I find intriguing these days is cooking is a survival tool too. I mean, without food, we don't survive. And yet that ability to create delicious food from very humble and cheap ingredients, it feels like vast swathes of our population no longer have those skills. And I feel a lot of my work is involving people taking back ownership with their wooden spoon and their chopping knife, the tools with which to feed themselves proper, healthy, nutritious food with not very much money, because it shouldn't cost a whole fortune.
One of the things that you touched on there, I think, connects beautifully, I think, with Mexican food and Mexican food culture, which is obviously a huge part of your life. How did you stumble across this kind of love for Mexican food and Mexican food culture? Where did it begin?
Well, my father persuaded me to do a VAT kind of scholarship thing in my gap year, which was pretty horrendous. When I was doing it, wasn't obviously suited to my personality. But at the end, they gave me a chunk of money and I went off traveling. And it happened that a friend from school ended up in Mexico. She said, come and join me. And I turned up in a country where I thought the national food was Tex-Mex. And I traveled around this extraordinary country for about 4.5 months, eating everything I could get my hands on. And I just found the food so exciting. The flavors, the ceviches on the beachside when I was trying to wipe off my tequila hangovers by eating kind of fresh, raw seafood and chilies and salsas on every table. And the way the food changed, the recipes changed as you traveled from state to state. I found this incredible cuisine that I knew nothing about, and it was delicious and it was exciting, and I'd never heard of it before. So that really awakened my first love.
Well, and what you mentioned excitement then, what has excited you and what continues to excite you about Mexican food and Mexican food culture?
So for me, the culture is incredible because you step off an airplane in Mexico City and you get into a taxi and you can immediately strike up a conversation with someone from a completely different walk of life by just talking to them about their food. And they will immediately tell you about the food that their grandparents their grandmother cooked them, what region they were from. Because like Italy, and I think probably like India, like lots of different places in the Far East, food is intrinsic to the Mexican culture. Like there's a saying that no proper business meeting would ever happen, or a deal would never be struck in the absence of food. Food is the fabric of everything. It's the glue that really glues. It's the glue that kind of gels the whole of society together. So that for me is just it's a kind of reminder of how I was brought up. Like food was everything to our entire family, and then the excitement just comes from the produce. Like this is a country which is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. And you go to those food markets in different regions of Mexico and you see, scores of different types of corn and hues of black and blue and red and white and yellow, multi-varietal types of tomatoes and tomatillos, courgettes and pumpkins. And, there are whole markets just devoted to beans. And you see these incredible beans with different patterns and shapes and sizes. Wow. It's just incredibly exciting, if you love food, to see 200 varieties of chilies.
Yeah.
Not all under one roof, but many under one roof.
Yeah. That's obviously, that inspiration has obviously fueled other parts of your life and your restaurant brand Oaxaca. Can you tell us what was it that you took from those experiences that inspired you to develop a restaurant brand, and also tell us a bit about the Oaxaca story?
Well, I think what was exciting for me about Mexico when I traveled around as a kind of 18-year-old with very little cash in her pocket is I ate like a king, even with not very much money. And I think when we were talking about Oaxaca, in those days, Mexican food had a really filthy reputation. Yeah. It was basically naff. It was kind of, it was not good. It was not cool. And we had to completely change people's perceptions of it. So the idea, even from going I was working with Sky Gingell in Peacham Nurseries, which had a Michelin star when I left, from going to that high-end environment and also from MasterChef, it just didn't feel right to set up straight away a high-end Mexican restaurant when all those flavors, inspiration came from the street. And also what I loved about Mexico was this idea that it doesn't matter what your background is, how much money you've got, you can still eat well. And the Mexicans have pride in how they eat. So we wanted to get that across in the idea that Oaxaca had to be food for everyone. It had to be fun, approachable, affordable food. And I think that also drove the sustainability agenda too. Because actually, if you look at the pre-Hispanic Mexican diet, it's very low on meat, and a lot of it is wild greens and these incredible, like the holy trinity of vegetables is the chilies and the beans and the corn with the courgette flour that kind of grows up between the rows of corns and beans, and it's a perfect organic food growth system. And I think those rich ingredients, vegetable led, and then proteins in the moles from ground up pumpkin seeds and different, and then the beans, it provided such a kind of sustainable holistic diet that it felt, I think anyway, from my work with slow food and also my training at Bali, which with heavy emphasis was on sustainability, where your food came from, what the produce was about in the first place. Oaxaca really had to be about produce and kind of about a low carbon footprint from the get-go, I think. And so that was really our ethos. Right from the word go, we were trying out prototypes to compact our glass so we could recycle it more easily. I think we were the second restaurant in London to recycle our food waste and make compost from it. And we did that, it's kind of as we were opening our doors. And we just really looked at ways that we could be innovative with how with our basic restaurant principles, I suppose. I guess that involves the menu, because in those early days I was talking to NGOs like Sustain to put me in touch with great farmers, and so when we opened we had amazing free range chicken and organic pork, but I still felt we had to have a really wide variety of vegetable dishes. And so even when we started 12 years ago, we had a really high proportion of vegetarian dishes, not vegan. We were quite slow on the vegan uptake, but definitely vegetarian. It felt right that people had an easy choice to vegetarian, and also a cheaper choice.
Yeah, I can imagine some of the audience watching today are asking themselves, as I think I was just a couple of moments ago, thinking, how do you balance the reality of running a commercial restaurant enterprise with some of the other things that you've already alluded to that you care hugely passionately about, like soil health and biodiversity, sustainability, planet health? They're not easy things to manage within a commercial enterprise. How do you tread that fine line, I suppose?
Well, I think there are two things. There's the difficult and there's the easy. Yeah. The difficult side were things like, right from the word go, we were very careful about what seafood and fish species we put on our menu. Yeah. And so we never had that easy fix of doing an incredible raw tuna tostada or, braised octopus marinated in dry chilies and lots of delicious foodie things that I would have loved to put on the menu that we felt would have been kind of sure winners, but that actually we just felt we just couldn't put those on our menu. It was just a decision we took early on. Yeah. And in essence, taking that decision early on and sticking to those principles became quite easy, because we weren't adapting. We just made those decisions. Yeah. I think for me, the positive story is that food and the environment are so linked, and how we eat has such a huge contribution to climate change and biodiversity and species extinction, which we read about so much, which feels such a big issue. But actually, being a restaurateur, because the individual has such power to change just how he or she eats. Every single one of us can make a massive impact by just eating vegetarian a few more times a week. Just, deciding to spend a bit of money at a local farm or a local market has a massive power. But if you times that by 1,000 or even more, if you own a group of restaurants, then that becomes really exhilarating, that you can offer, a huge range of vegetables. I remember when I started talking to my team about putting a few organic vegetables on our menus, and they were kind of didn't really get it. And they thought that organic, which I guess has been rebranded a bit under the guise of regenerative farming, because we now know how important soil health is and protecting the earthworm, which is such a great, enrich your soil, and the bee, stuff like this, which is so vital to our survival, we're beginning to understand about. But in early days, organic was a bit of a kind of fancy for rich kids, not really a thing. But actually nowadays, when you're talking about buying vegetables from regenerative farms, people kind of get it a bit more. And it's so nice that we can say that some of the vegetables are from Rimford Organic, or, this lovely guy in Ireland's making our tortillas, and these collaborations we're doing, I think our customers really believe in and buy into. And of course, that's so important for any brand these days. You have to walk the walk. You can't just create these stories if you're not actually doing it, because customers are intelligent and they can read and they care. I really do think people care these days.
One thing I was just going to ask you on that topic, actually, do you find that when you're able to articulate some of those types of messages at a within the restaurant environment, there are conversations that can happen between your team and people that are actually dining? Does it kind of get down to that kind of level, rather than something that's perhaps you're doing behind the scenes because of all the reasons that you've just described? But can that conversation happen at a customer level now?
So I think certainly for us in the early days, we were so conscious of many more things we could be doing, and we didn't really want to be holier than thou. It kind of jamming your kind of sustainability message down someone's throat can be a bit off-putting. I think you want to be a bit cooler than that. Yeah. And yet we got to a stage where we realised we'd invested quite a lot of money and work and kind of energy into our core principles, and then we weren't really getting those messages out there. I think social media is a brilliant tool for sending out those kind of messages, because you can allow people to find out about what you're doing and send messages that you might not be able to so easy when people are just sitting down in an environment wanting to just have fun, drink a margarita and eat some great tacos.
Of course.
Equally, though, we can really easily tell our staff about that. And what we found is it's incredibly important to our staff. It really engages them and it really retains them. And we've got lots and lots of staff who've been with us for 10 years or more. Many more have been with us for 7 years or more. So they really care about it. And I do think that they can communicate it in a kind of, it's not like they are ever going to throw it down someone's throat because they're too busy trying to get the food on the table. But in some conversations, in the kind of quieter times, those messages can get out there too. So, but I do think these days, as a brand, social media is a brilliant tool that we are now, I think, only just harnessing to really try and get more of those messages out there.
Yeah. And as you say, it's a non-pressurized way that if someone is receptive to that, they can go off and find the story, can't they? It works.
Yeah, and really equally, if they don't give a damn and they just want to eat great tacos, that's great too.
Yeah. It's obviously been a hugely, hugely tough year for all areas of hospitality. From your perspective, what have been some of the lows, but also what have been some of the high points as well, some of the takeouts from this year that we've been through?
Well, I think, as anyone who works in hospitality can attest, visiting an empty restaurant is heartbreaking. And seeing our staff at home, because the furloughing scheme, was incredibly generous in lockdown 1, less generous in lockdown 2. But even so, people stuck at home, having to do the homeschooling and stuff. It was a difficult time for everyone amidst a background of people dying and all that stuff. So obviously not good. I think what I feel most proud about is how our industry really rallied together, and we fed ICU units, we fed nurses, we fed local neighbours, we fed kids who would otherwise have gone hungry over the school holidays. And I think when I look at the amazing response that our industry had, with money that frankly they didn't have either, it was just incredible. And as I know from my personal experience, my chefs were clamouring to get into our kitchens to make food for kids' hampers through a collaboration with chefs in schools. And Lulu Dillon did this incredible Cook 19 project too, which we were so proud to be part of. So those were real highs for me. But also, I know that it's difficult. It's a difficult message to say the positives you took out of a really tricky time, which was invariably much harder, I think, for people from lower income backgrounds. And that disparity of wealth really upsets me. And I think it's something we have to address through government food policy. And, the idea that in a modern world, 1, people live in the streets and 2, people cannot afford to eat, fruit and vegetables, healthy food, is a travesty. But we can go into that another day. But I think the positives we found from just slowing down a bit and taking stock were things like finding an amazing new chicken farmer in Devon who is working with a local other farmer to feed his chicken with grain growing in the next door farm rather than any grain that's grown in Amazon basin. Things like that we were working on all the way through lockdown. And so I felt actually it was a really productive time where we had the time and energy to focus on things that otherwise in the kind of crazy run of life that we were happening before lockdown, we just didn't have time to do so much.
And perhaps then ultimately have a bigger impact, I guess. It's the time to make impact.
I think people started, for the first time perhaps in a long time, really thinking about where their food came from. And that scare when the supermarket shelves became empty, it is a wake-up call, because how we produce food is under threat. We've got fewer and fewer species, and that puts massive strain and threat on our food supplies. If you have one variety of banana, it gets blight, then suddenly you have no bananas left to eat. And there are many stories of how soil fertility is plummeting. The way we farm is just no longer viable if we want to feed all of us in the future. So I think people are beginning to hear the stories. I became hooked on a podcast called Farmerama, which is just fascinating on how we grow food and the nutrition in food, because we take it for granted when we eat that we're feeding ourselves. But then we learn that a lot of the food we eat has basically zero nutrition. The ultra-processed foods that occupies 52% of our shopping baskets has no nutrition. In fact, it's positively damaging. So then, how do we overcome challenges like that and look to a better future where we're feeding each other on all incomes better food that's better for the environment at the same time?
So
interesting and exciting challenges.
What are your hopes then for the future in kind of food and drink? Sitting here today looking for, what are those things that you go, we've got to solve this, we need to find a solution to that? What are those things?
Well, I think what's so exciting is that entrepreneurs are innovative in their cause. They can't help being. And I think food entrepreneurs particularly are so on the cutting edge always, and are some of the most creative people I know. And I think now that we know the link between healthy gut, healthy soil, and a healthy planet, that link is so established now that it seems almost as simple. It's incredibly complicated on many levels, but at least we know the right direction to travel. And at least we know that our customers engage with it as well. Even more so maybe than governments, who I always feel a few steps behind everything. Yeah. So I think for food entrepreneurs, there is an open market for being innovative, for reaching out direct to growers and producers and farmers, and doing the right thing as well as making money from it. And I think that is a world that we want to, rear our children in, seeing them flourish in, is a world that we give to them that's in a slightly better state than you could argue that it is right now. Yeah. And that is a really positive challenge for all of us, and one that I really, want to attack with relish.
Yeah. If you could, you've touched on policy and government policy a couple of times. I have to ask you, because if you were able to have a greater influence on that policy, what are some of the things that you would do?
Well, I think definitely encouraging farmers financially with how they look after their soil is an absolute given. Yeah. I think there's got to be some piece on helping people on lower incomes even get to afford fresh fruit and vegetables, because at the moment their diets are really pretty abysmal, and you can see that from the government's own statistics about how much diet related deaths are caused now every year compared to alcohol or smoking related. So it is an issue. A lot of people have been killed by the food they eat, and so I think we really have to look at these things. And I think government policy can help that really easily. And then just in schools, I'm a trustee of an amazing charity called Chefs in Schools. And we find that just by putting one passionate chef into a school kitchen, he can completely transform how a whole school eats. And so one really easy, simple initiative that a government can just do tomorrow would to make sure that in every Ofsted report, school food is right up there and things are important. Yeah. Because if it's in an Ofsted report, then a head teacher has to take notice and will want to take notice, because head teachers are busy, they're overworked. But if it's right there in an Ofsted report, they will take notice. And, how can we transform how our nation eats? With our children first. Yeah. And if they're learning how to cook and eat delicious wholesome vegetables and lentils and beans and other delicious things that are also good for them and the planet, then that's kind of almost we're on the right track already.
It has to, it absolutely has to start there. If you can encourage some of the basic principles that you had in your childhood, some of those skills, the ones that I had in mind, but also the joy that comes with a group of people sharing food, that everything around that kind of healthy relationship with food and drink, then filters out into so many other parts of a child's life. Just some of those basic principles are so important.
Yes, and the amazing writer Bea Wilson also has a brilliant charity, which is it's called Tasted, and she literally goes in schools and just gets young children just tasting, fresh vegetables and fruit. But before they taste them, they have to cover, what they look like, what they smell like, what's the touch of a peach, and it's such a clever thing, and children go mad for it. So I think all those types of initiative, where really the pleasure of eating, good food, the flavour, the taste, that pleasure is kind of incredible. And to try and impart that in kids who've never really eaten well must be the most exciting thing.
Definitely. Thomasina, thank you so much for your rich and diverse perspective and personal stories as well about Mexican food, running a restaurant brand, and also the bigger issues in industry that we face now and into the future. It's been an absolute pleasure to welcome you as a speaker for our 2020 Trend Summit in this new online format for this year. Thomasina, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.